Technically, I was the legal advisor to the Article 32 officer. The Article 32 officer was appointed by the general. That was his job to investigate and make a recommendation to the general as to whether the charges should go forward. I, on the other hand, was there as his legal advisor because they anticipated that the accused, MacDonald, would have civilian lawyers and the government had lawyers, and Colonel Rock, of course, was a special forces guy. He's not a lawyer, but a really smart guy. He's probably in his 50s, he's a full colonel, and took the job very seriously and wanted to see that justice was done. So I got to be his legal advisor, and I was the luckiest guy in the world. I mean, where else could a young lawyer like me get a chance to be a part of probably the most famous murder case in the history of certainly the Army? Maybe. But I'll tell you one thing, it was really quite an honor. I mean, I couldn't believe my luck, particularly after my little trip down at Fort Polk, of getting a chance to become the legal advisor. It was great. Well, like I said, when I got to Fort Bragg, I think I'd come with a message for the staff judge advocate, who was my boss, a full colonel, who told me that there would be no more of this foolishness like happened at Fort Polk with me and the general down there. And he said he was going to make sure that none of that happened again. I would not be a judge up there. I said, well, okay, whatever. I said, I've got 2 years to go. I'll be glad to do whatever you tell me. So he then proceeded to stick me in the basement of the post headquarters, a place down there with no windows and just a little teeny office. And that was my existence at that time. And everything was fine. I just go to work, do my thing. And one day the general happened to come down there, a 3-star general that ran the place. And we got to chatting, and he wanted to know what in the world I was doing down there. And we talked, and eventually it turned out that he had to have a report written for the Department of the Army, at least his recommendations about drug use and how to deal with it in the military, and asked me if I'd help him, if I would write the report for him. I said, sure. And lo and behold, it got adopted by the Department of the Army, and that made the general look really good, and he was very appreciative of my service. So from then on, it didn't make a difference what the staff judge advocate said about me. He liked me, and then several months later is when this horrible murder took place involving MacDonald and his 2 children. And so the general very kindly asked me if I was interested in being the judge, or what's called the legal advisor, to the Article 32 officer. The difference is that as a judge, you're the one who is in control of everything. Whereas with a legal advisor, my job was to advise Colonel Rock, who was the Article 32 officer. He was a full colonel, and his job was to investigate and make a recommendation to the convening authority, the general, as to whether this case ought to go forward with actual trial. That's why jeopardy didn't attach, and that's why they ended up trying him later, 10 years later. So of course, naturally I said, yes, Lord, I felt very honored that I got selected to do that. And I think I was the envy of every lawyer out there because everybody wanted that job. It was a great one. And so we're off and running, and I got to do it. Oh, well, they don't have really fancy facilities, at least not in 1969 they didn't. Most of the base was still just old World War II type buildings, wooden buildings. And I don't remember specifically where it was. It was just a small building that probably held 40 or 50 people at the most. And it was packed with press the entire time until later on when it got closed. So it was very small. Acoustics was terrible. It was just typical old wooden building, and it was set up so that Colonel Rock was up there and I was sitting next to him, and then the defense table and the prosecution table were in front of us, and they had a little place there for the witness to sit. And they recorded, of course, verbatim everything that was said at the 32. Remember, but I know there's a verbatim transcript that somebody typed, and that was assumed was a court reporter, but I don't know. Well, this is 1969. The Manson murders had just happened in California, which was involved in this case, at least it felt like it was. There was, of course, this is a huge military base. A lot of demonstrations going on. Everybody hated the war. Everybody was against the war. And of course, we were the war personified, being at Fort Bragg. And so, we were constantly being confronted by demonstrators, et cetera. That, of course, remember, the fort was wide open. There wasn't like it is today where everything's gated and you can't get in without a pass. Back then, anybody could come on the fort anytime they wanted to. That's how we believe that the murderess and her friends got on the fort that night that it happened. It had to do with what can we as the Army do to deal with these trainees and military personnel that are using drugs while they're on active duty. We had to be able to deal with the problem. So how do you solve the problem? How do you deal with it once you have the problem? And so it was basically just kind of a guideline for commanders of how to deal with these problems when they arose. It's a very general type layout for suggestions of how to do it and how to try to get them help medically. That was called for. So it was not a great work of art, I assure you, but it was good enough for the generals to get recognized for it, and that was great. Well, we really didn't know, but it seemed like that there was more and more of it. You got to remember, I'll never forget, we had doctors coming on active duty as a full colonel with hair down to the middle of their back. This was atypical of a military person because they didn't allow for people to run around with hair like that. But they were so short of professionals, particularly doctors, didn't have any choice. They had to take them in as they were. They weren't going to get their hair cut. So I guess they could have court-martialed all of them, but that wouldn't do any good because then they'd still be without the doctors. So as a result, they just had to put up with it. It was a weird scene because the hippie movement was going on real big, and people were running around with long hair and acting nuts with all these demonstrations, and they were totally against the war in Vietnam, that was for sure. A lot of crime, yeah. Well, robberies, rapes within the military, a lot of disrespect to their senior officers, which was just uncalled for in the military. I mean, you just couldn't do it unless you were a judge. But that really wasn't disrespect, just a difference of opinion, let's just put it that way, okay? Because I remember when people would come back from fighting over there in Vietnam, the people would look on them. They were not welcomed as heroes and, gee, thank you for your service. It was, you're nuts. What the world are you doing over there fighting a stupid war like that? And that was the general mood of the public of how it was. And of course, we didn't have any choice. We were drafted, we had to go in. We had to fight whether we liked it or not. Or we could be a deserter or something. There was plenty of those. A lot of people were deserting, going to Canada to avoid having to serve in that war. It was a very unpopular war. Well, I said, look, I'm an American citizen. I'm glad. I love my country. And if they say I've got to go fight and do whatever I got to do, I'm going to do it. I don't argue with them. That's the law in the country, and so that's part of my duty as a citizen. I got to accept the law as it is. I might not approve of the war itself. However, I'll go do my part and I'll fight in it if I had to. Yeah. And of course, I remember, I can't remember whether the My Lai massacre happened before or after us, but my Lord, what a terrible black eye for the military having allegedly killed all these innocent civilians over there in Vietnam. And it was just terrible. I mean, you just couldn't even fathom somebody doing something like that. I don't even remember the name of the guy, Lieutenant Cowley or something like that, and there was a major somebody. And so that looked pretty bad. And then here we are over there fighting and losing them. We weren't winning anything. Every time we turned around, we were getting our tails handed to us. So it was really a sad situation. Yeah, the My Lai, right after it, yeah. Because I know ours was pretty long, but I think theirs was longer. I think I was getting most of my information from the paper and the TV and about these hippies supposedly coming into the house and attacking MacDonald and his wife and killing them. And then, of course, you heard the other side of the military part where the CID and the MPs putting out stories that were just the opposite, that it was MacDonald that had done it. So, you kind of wondered, who to believe, but it was kind of hard to believe MacDonald had been a part of something like this because, I mean, not only was he a Green Beret physician, a Princeton man, but, happily married with 2 kids. I mean, that kind of guy just doesn't go around slaughtering his family as a general rule. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but it just didn't make sense to me, but I was open. I mean, that's what I was there for, is to give the colonel advice on legal rulings, but I sat there and heard every bit of the evidence that the government had, and it was pretty sad. It was just not enough to convince anybody that he had done anything. Yeah. I don't remember. I saw that when I was trying to refresh my memory, and I went back and read some of the Article 32 stuff. There was nothing in the paperwork about those. I mean, it was the actual Bernie actually questioning those witnesses before the trial. I think what happened, if I recall, is that I think that he made a request that he be allowed to interview these witnesses. And of course, we didn't see anything wrong with it as long as they wanted to. You can't force a witness to talk to a lawyer before. But if they want to do it, that's fine. And I think we said that'd probably be a good, I think Colonel Rock ruled that way, that they'd have a right to talk to him. And so I'm sure they did. I don't specifically remember too much about that. Yes, yeah. It seemed like they were holding everything back and from the defense and not giving them what we hoped was going to be a free and open exchange of information so that the defense could then prepare and get ready for trial rather than waste all the time. Because when you get a hit with the first time in a trial, you sometimes have to take great recesses to give a chance to let them read the stuff if there's recorded statements or something that they could have easily given to the defense to start with. In most courts, particularly civilian courts, that's a routine thing as part of your discovery. They have to give it to the defense. But we do know of cases where they hid stuff from them. That's talking about the prosecution hiding things from the defense. It happened in the MacDonald trial, apparently, which was 10 years after my involvement. But anyway, I thought the CID and the MPs had bumbled the whole job. It was a disaster. Because you got to remember, excuse me, the night it happened, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, pouring down rain, freezing cold. And initially there was probably 6 or 8 MPs that just tracked through the House, and it poured down rain was all over the place, picking up things, putting the phone back on the hook. Okay. So there was serious questions about how they had bumbled the whole thing. And that was what was so frustrating, because you've got to preserve a crime scene in order to get to the truth. 3 o'clock in the morning. Most of these MPs were very young people that had never seen a dead body in their life. And you can imagine the shock when they walked into, because they were called to that headquarters. I don't remember what the reason was, but anyway, somebody was dispatched to go over there. And when they did, it was MacDonald they had called, that's right. And when they got there, when they walked in the back door, it was apparently the door they went in, first thing they saw was Colette MacDonald laying on the floor dead. MacDonald was there next to her, and both the young kids were in their beds, and they were both murdered. So pretty scary, and you can imagine these youngsters, they were probably panicking just a little bit, and they started tracking through the house, looking and putting things like the phone back on the hook. I think there was a knife that somebody picked up. MacDonald's wallet was on the floor initially. Somebody walked off with it. I don't think they ever found it. So it kind of destroyed the credibility of what was to be coming later on at the hearing, because how could you believe that these people are professional investigators when they screw up a crime scene like that? And of course, there was all kinds of blood all over the place, and people had put their hands on it, and the clothes had a lot of blood on them, and they'd moved the bodies and moved the clothing. It really challenged the credibility of the witnesses and the believability of what they had to say, because it just seemed like they had destroyed the crime scene by what they did. I didn't stop them from moving forward. And of course, eventually the CID showed up, and that's the Criminal Intelligence Division. They're supposedly the super cops, I guess, and they didn't do a whole lot better than the MPs did with the way they handled all this. So, but anyway, that's what happened, and it was sad. What was the CID what? Well, their explanation was that since they couldn't find anybody else in the immediate vicinity right after the thing happened, there was only one person that could have done it, and that was MacDonald, because he's the only one still there that was living. And so they decided that he was the one who had committed the murders, and that's what they focused their investigation on, is to prove that, which is what they failed in doing, in my opinion. But yeah, I remember a little bit Micah particularly, because he was, I think, the first one that testified. And I think that he recalled that when he arrived, that the back door was open and that he came in, and of course, I think his boss Trevor, whatever his name was right in front of him. And they came in and they saw Colette's body there on the master bedroom floor, and MacDonald was on top of her, if I recall correctly. And I think he devoted most of his time to trying to help MacDonald. That's what it seemed like he was doing. I think he gave him some, resuscitation, because he kept coming in and out. And apparently he'd suffered wounds, and I think he testified that he had wounds on his body and eventually had to be hauled off to the hospital. Of course, Colette was dead. Both the children were dead. And he testified to what he observed there on the crime scene itself, such as the coffee table in the living room, which is the story about where MacDonald supposedly was on the couch asleep. When these intruders came in, they'd killed all those people and came back, attacked him, and the coffee table had gotten knocked over and it was on its side rather than all the way over on its top. There was a flower pot that was on its side that got stood up by all the influx of the people coming in. There was, can't remember, a robe or a blanket or something that he remembered seeing, but yet in the pictures that they took right after that, it wasn't there. There was just all kinds of inconsistencies that he observed, and it really started to raise questions in your mind. Well, gee whiz, what were they doing? Who was moving all this stuff? And apparently, it was like the telephone. I mean, where's the telephone? Normally you have it on the cradle. Of course, it's not like phones we have today, so I guess somebody had to put that back, and the coffee table was on its side. The flower pot was tipped over, and I guess somebody had to sit it back up, correcting how things ought to look, I guess. But that's not how they looked, apparently, when the attack took place. So all that raised questions in my mind, I can tell you that. Eventually, I think he said he went back to take care of MacDonald some more, and then the people from Womack Hospital came over and hauled him off to the hospital. That's right. And yet the photos had him on there, if I recall correctly. I don't remember that much in detail about that. I just remember somebody apparently her midriff and a part of her breast were exposed, and I guess one of the cops had to cover it up for fear that somebody would perhaps see something they shouldn't. I don't know. But somebody did, because apparently that's not the way they remembered it initially when he testified. So I guess somebody just moving things around. Of course, I think the pajama top belonged to MacDonald, if I remember correctly, and all he had on was just his bottoms. He had stab and puncture wounds from the knife that the attackers had stabbed him with. Anyway, sorry, I can't remember. It's only been 49 years. Yeah. Well, I insisted on doing what I thought the general wanted us to do, which was to have a hearing that was open and a free exchange of information. It was like pulling eye teeth to get the government to give any evidence to the defense ahead of time. And it was just horrible. And every time it would come up and I would have to make a legal ruling on it, I would insist that they produce whatever it is we need to produce, and let's get on with this, because we're wasting an awful lot of time. And maybe that's why it took so long to have the 32, I don't know. But I think eventually we did get some of the evidence produced. I don't think they produced it all, because apparently there was a lot more that came out at the trial 10 years later that we never saw. Great. He was solid as a rock. Full colonel, been in the military probably 30 years, and was a commander of some special forces, and was literally straight as an arrow. And his whole thing was, we're going to do this right, and we're going to be fair to both sides, and we're going to get all the evidence in, and then we're going to take a look at it, and then I'll make my report to the general. He wasn't, Lord help me. I don't think that full colonels that are commanders of special forces units have any feelings, okay? That was the impression I got. They are really tough as nails. And so it was just simply a matter of, Bill, I want to do this, or you need to make a ruling on this, or whatever. He would tell me what he wanted done, and it would get done. I think that probably the only time I really saw any emotion out of him was the time when we went to the quarters where the murders took place. And this time it was without all the accompaniment of the CID and all the rest of the people. Just went over there as he wanted to try this little experiment with this table. We'd had all kinds of testimony that the CID guy had bumped into the table and kicked it, knocked it over, and every time it was so top heavy, it would flip all the way over on its top. Not one time, according to the CID, did it ever land on its side. Of course, don't forget that's how it was sitting when they arrived at the crime scene initially. And I mean, he couldn't have been any more determined that that was a scientific experiment that he had done. And not only him, but several other CIDs had done it. Every one of them all landed on its top. So when the colonel and I went over there to the place, of course, the colonel just bumped into it, and how did it land? Land on its side. And he said, he kind of laughed, and he said, "So much for that theory," because obviously that showed that perhaps the CID wasn't quite as much of an expert as they thought they were. So I think that at least that piece of evidence, the quality of it went way down after his little experiment with it. Yeah, I think so. I think that was the biggest thing. And I think MacDonald, when he testified, I think it moved him. Because this was sad. You got to remember, these people are, what, 25, 30 years old? Babies are 2, 3. I mean, you've got a lot of dead people, and they shouldn't be dead. And it just was impossible to believe that somebody of his education, his experience, his relationship with his wife, that he could possibly have gotten so enraged that he'd kill her and kill his 2 kids. I mean, that's just beyond belief. I mean, I've gotten mad with my wife before, but never mad enough to kill her. And I just can't imagine somebody doing it, although I'm sure it probably does happen. But the kids, come on now. You know, what did they do? They didn't do a damn thing. And it's just incredible to think that he would have killed his wife and 2 kids. I think he even said that on one of those TV shows that he was on, that he was interviewed. Jeffrey, yeah, that why in the world, what did I have to gain by killing my wife and 2 children? Absolutely nothing. His life was going fine. He was doing really well and doing what he wanted to do. So I think that was about the only time I saw any emotion out of him, because he was really straight-laced. Colonel Rock, yeah, he was really, he kept the emotions out of it and just deal with the facts, just the facts. And he was very good at what he did. So I was absolutely convinced that he was not guilty of a thing. We identified the murderess, Helena Stokely, got her address, phone number. She's a civilian, lived downtown Fayetteville, part of the hippie scene down there. Her 3 buddies that were with her, they got their names, their addresses. I mean, it was all there. And it was exactly the way he had described it. And if I recall correctly, we even had testimony she had admitted that she had done it, or there was something weird about the day of the funeral, that this Helena Stokely had some kind of service at her house about being so sad she was draped in black. And what's she got to do with these people? She didn't even know them, supposedly, you know? But yet, that really did raise some interesting questions. And MacDonald was believable. The evidence was believable that he didn't do anything. Nothing wrong. That was my opinion. Of course, my opinion wasn't very important, but Colonel Rock's was, and Colonel Rock sure believed that, because I think in his report he said that there's just not sufficient evidence to charge him with anything. And that's why he was let out of the Army. Of course, then he became his own worst enemy, apparently, sadly. I can't remember. Yeah, I remember the name, yeah. It seemed like the defense called, that's how it came up, yeah. Yeah, Posey was some neighbor. He was the one who testified about that service, or whatever you want to call it, that she had. And it seemed like to me that she might have mentioned that she was out there at the time this happened. Okay, well, and he had nothing to gain or lose one way or the other. He was just a civilian living in Fort Bragg next door to her. Fayetteville, living next door to her. But yeah, I do remember that name, and you mentioned it comes back. Never, not one time. How did it happen? Because that would then make them look terrible. They had already decided who did it. That was MacDonald. Nobody else. And that's their whole investigation was geared towards convicting him or getting charges brought against him. And so why would they want to then go and point the finger at somebody else? It just made me feel like they weren't interested in the truth. They were just interested in making themselves look good at that point. That they're the ones who chose to charge him with it. And so let's just look at that evidence and disregard anything else. Now, I remember faintly Colonel Rock asking somebody, why can't the FBI get involved in this thing? CID has no jurisdiction over a civilian, so why can't we get the FBI involved? And we were told the FBI refused to get involved because the crime scene was so screwed up by the MPs and the CID. And I believe that. I do. Now, I think later on the FBI did get involved and it went to trial, but I don't know a whole lot about that because I wasn't there. I faintly remember that, and I remember that she was known to the local police down there as being part of this hippie culture and a weirdo and a drug addict and all that. Okay. I'm sorry. Oh, brother. Yeah, he was the one, that's right, that testified that he'd seen a woman with a floppy hat pouring down rain 3 o'clock in the morning out there on the fort, which is really weird because what in the world would somebody be out there dressed just like the hippie that he described that had just attacked him, and he saw him just a matter of probably within an hour of the attack itself. That was pretty dramatic, Coffee Time. Well, if it hadn't happened 49 years ago, I would probably be able to remember it a little better. All three of those things, I think, had a dramatic effect on Colonel Rock's ultimate recommendation charges be dropped. I think he was convinced, I know I was, that MacDonald was not guilty of a thing, except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was very lucky he didn't get killed that night. Granted, his wounds were not nearly as bad as Colette's and the kids, but they were bad enough. I think he'd suffered a collapsed lung and some other things. And of course, I remember one of the most silly points that the government tried to argue at the 32 was that MacDonald had self-inflicted these wounds that caused his partial pneumothorax by putting a knife in a door and closing the door so it would hold the knife there and then backing up into the knife, causing these wounds. That did get a rise out of MacDonald. Out of Colonel Rock. He couldn't believe that they were arguing such foolishness because nobody is going to do that because they might kill themselves, There are a lot of vital organs there in that part where those stab wounds were. I think we had some doctors testify to that, that it's just something that you just couldn't take a chance on because you could very well kill yourself. Plus, can you imagine, putting the knife in the door and then backing up to it? Kind of ludicrous, and I think that had a lot to do with it. Some of this is coming back to me. I apologize, I didn't mention it before. And of course, MacDonald was a very compelling witness because he was articulate, he was very educated, and he was a good Army man. That's what you loved about him because, most doctors would never get close to the special forces because those are those people that do jump out of airplanes and they got to have a loose screw anyway somewhere, to do that kind of stuff. But to have a doctor of his stature to want to be part of that really spoke volumes of the kind of guy he was. And I think that had a lot to do with how Colonel Rock felt about his ultimate decision. And of course, all this stuff hanging out there about Stokely and everything pointed to her. And yet nobody bothered to ever even go and do anything about it. And it was sad. And of course, that's why he was cut loose from the military with no charges. And then you can only imagine the shock I felt. I don't know about Colonel Rock, I haven't talked to him since. I got a subpoena to the grand jury in 1974 to go to Raleigh. And I was practicing law here in Columbia at the time. I went up there and I thought to myself, what in the world could they possibly want my testimony before a federal grand jury in this case? Because I was just a little old legal advisor to the 32 officer. And I got up there and that Brian Murtaugh, whatever his name was, the prosecutor, asked his question to me was, well, what did you do to influence Colonel Rock to write his report that way? I said, not a damn thing, thank you. I said, captains don't tell colonels what to do. I said, I was just a legal advisor there and that was my job. I said, well, it's obvious that you were very much involved in all this and that's the reason why he got cut loose. And I said, nope. I said, I didn't know MacDonald from Adam's house cat. And my job was there to rule on the evidence. And I said, I heard it all. I said, and I'm not an idiot. I said, there was no evidence that was compelling to believe that any charges should even be brought, much less that you could prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I said, we did identify who the murderess was. I said, that's where you ought to be guiding yourself, but I said, do what you need to do. Well, anyway, he put me before the grand jury, and I testified, and I told him what my opinion was, and didn't make any difference because, 5 more years later, I read he's on trial, and I could not believe what I was seeing. And then to be convicted, that was just unreal. And to this day, my heart still goes out to him and his family because, I mean, it's just a horrible miscarriage of justice, in my opinion. Yeah. If I recall correctly, the defense said that they had psychiatrists that would testify that they had done their interviews and talking to MacDonald, tests and whatever, and they were going to testify that under no circumstances was MacDonald even capable of having committed the crimes, in their psychiatric opinion, which was pretty compelling, you know. And of course, the government said, well, that's just a bunch of baloney, you know, that we haven't had any psychiatrists check him out. So Colonel Rock, trying to be fair, said, okay, fine, let him go up to Washington to Walter Reed, and we'll have him shrunk up there by the government's ranks. And he told me to go with him, so of course I accompanied him up there for that. And he was shrunk all up by the government psychiatrists, and they all came to the same conclusion, that he couldn't possibly have done it. It wasn't in his psychic, his makeup, which I think was pretty compelling as part of the eventual results of throwing the charges out. Pretty bad. Very much so, yeah. He didn't want anything to do with it. I mean, most people, I guess, I know I would be. Would somebody want to shrink me up? Forget it. But I guess he realized how important it was, and I guess Mr. Siegel probably told him that he needed to do it, Siegel being his lawyer. And so he finally acquiesced, and it turned out, I thought, in his favor. No, I don't remember that, but I probably did. Mike said I did. That's probably what I said. Yeah, because I think that, if anything, I was just trying to convey the message that I thought that the defense needed to know, which was, gee, you boys need to play along with this and let them go ahead and do what they needed to do. Again, being part of that transparency and openness and giving Colonel Rock access to all the information he might have needed. So, and they got the job done, but apparently it didn't help. I don't know whatever happened to all that psychiatric testimony. I doubt it even came into the trial in Raleigh, but it may have, I don't know. I wasn't a part of it. Yeah, well, that was the only thing they could find was the fact that he had had an affair with some gal, some one-night stand down when he was at one of those courses in San Antonio, I think. But, you know, I mean, been married to her for, 5, 6, 7 years, and they had 2 beautiful children. And other than that, I don't think there was any problems. That certainly is no reason that he would have killed his wife and 2 kids. That's absurd. I don't really remember. I think it was, yes, the children wet the bed. Yeah, that was the reason. That's right. You can imagine how Colonel Rock and I both redacted to that. Is that what you do when your children wet the bed, is you murder them? I mean, that is a bit of a stretch, particularly when you're talking about a guy as smart and as educated and being in the field of saving people's lives, not taking them. That was absurd. But that was their only argument they had for his motive in killing his wife and 2 kids. You're right. Yeah, something like that. But so what? I mean, you don't kill your wife and kids because of that. I guess you could, but I didn't buy it. I don't think Colonel Rock bought it, and I don't think the general bought it. Siegel, I thought he was brilliant. I thought he was really a good lawyer. You could tell he's one of these high-priced guys. I think he was from Philly at the time. I think later on he moved out to San Francisco, I guess, and did something out there. But you know, I was still a young lawyer, and I hadn't seen that many great lawyers like him. I'd seen that guy from Darlington that was a great. I seen a trial when I was in law school. I went to the court and watched this guy try this case, and it was just incredible to watch some fellow with that experience try a case, and that was the way it's supposed to be done. And I thought Mr. Siegel was a bit wordy on occasion, but I thought he really did a brilliant job with what he had. His little assistant Eisman, I wasn't too impressed with him. He fulfilled the role of a lackey and a runner more than he did lawyer, okay? That was my opinion, but I thought Bernie was really good. I don't think he played much of a role. I remember that he wanted to be a part of the defense team and actually be a part of it, and I think that the colonel said no. I don't remember what the reason was, but I just remember there was something about that. But one of the interesting things was that, all these hearings in the Article 32 were open to the public. So therefore, the father-in-law, Freddie Kassab, the wife of Colette, the mother of Colette was there. They all sat right on the front row. They were his biggest supporters throughout the whole thing. Jeffrey's mother was there the whole time. And of course the press was there. My Lord, we had more press you could shake a stick at. And back then it's not like it is today. All three major networks were there, and every day they were reporting on what was going on. And I think that at some point somebody decided, that's enough of this. And so I was ordered by the general to close it down. There weren't going to be any more public hearings in this thing. And I remember that Bernie appealed that thing. It's the only way I got in the Court of Military Appeals decisions was I was named as a defendant in that when he tried to get that reversed. And the Court of Military Appeals upheld it and said that it was proper. The general had a right to close it if he wanted it closed, so didn't have to have it open. I think they didn't like what they were seeing was happening. I think the government probably is the one who said, gee, we're getting a black eye here because the stuff is going out is not in our favor. So maybe we ought to just shut it down and make sure it doesn't go out anymore. That was my guess. Yeah, it is. And they were so used to doing things their way. And just like I remember when I first started in the military, you had, like in special court martials, you had a president of the court, you had a judge, but then you had a president of the court, and then you had the court members. And it was the president of the court that ran the trial, not the judge. It was really a strange way to do business, at least in the legal field as I knew it. But that's the way they had done it for 150 years. And then when they passed that Military Justice Act of 68, that's when it really elevated the judge into an independent decision-making role, which we tried to do. And I think it was all for the good. I think that if the judges made errors, that's why you have an appeal process. The staff judge advocate can always appeal it to the next higher level and probably get what he wants, because they do tend to support themselves, the military, and so I don't know. Up until then, it was really hard for me to believe there was a whole lot of justice in their justice system, but I saw it firsthand in MacDonald, and I know justice was done in that hearing because just the way the general wanted it done, the way the colonel wanted it done, and it was wide open, and everybody got a chance to say what they need to. All you got to do is look at some of those objections by Mr. Siegel. They go on and on, page after page. He was very wordy, and he could say a lot. And he was a kid. He never tried anything like that in his life. But he held his own. Okay, he did all right. He lost, but he did okay. I don't know whether he had any role in the ultimate trial, but probably not. So I don't know. I just thought that for once the military got it right and the civilians got it wrong when they convicted him. I just thought it was just terrible. And I don't think there was any justice up there in that trial, at least from what little bit I know about it. I wasn't present, but some of the things the prosecution did in that case, from what I've read, were just nothing short of horrendous. The prosecutor ended up getting disbarred for withholding evidence from the government, from the defense team, and some of the threats that he made against that Helena Stokely, who was called to testify at the trial because she'd admitted that she had done it to a number of people. And then all of a sudden, after the prosecutor got through with her in in his office, talking to her, threatening her, all of a sudden she couldn't remember nothing. And I think it hurt the defense considerably. Freddie? Yeah, and he was the biggest supporter, I thought, that MacDonald had in the whole trial. Because he was apparently some well-to-do guy from Long Island or someplace, and that's where I think Jeffrey was from, was Long Island. And he and his family just were totally in support of MacDonald. There's no way in the world he could have done it. That was their opinion, and he did testify. But yet, when the military cut him loose, and he went to the West Coast and just became an ER physician out there, I think he started living a lifestyle that probably was not conducive to somebody who had just lost his wife and 2 kids. And then he went on some of these TV shows and just didn't act like the grieving husband who had lost his wife and 2 kids. And as a result, it really got Kasab all worked up, I think, and he had some powerful friends in Congress, I think. The next thing you know, he has gotten MacDonald indicted because he just turned 180 degrees. He was convinced that MacDonald had killed his stepdaughter. It wasn't even his daughter. He did, because otherwise it would have died a natural death. I mean, it would have been the end of it. I don't know. I can't imagine a civilian, just a person, has that much power they could actually get somebody indicted. But he sure did. I give him credit. No, I didn't know that. Well, then he shouldn't have been sitting on the front row cheering, you know? I mean, if he's such a good, he was convinced that MacDonald didn't do anything for the whole time 32 went on. But then after it's over with, all of a sudden now his great investigative skills determined that he was just wrong the whole time. Well, that's ridiculous. There wasn't any new evidence that had come forth. Never knew it ever. He was just that kind. Everything he played close to the vest, and whatever he thought, that was his opinion. He asked me to write parts of the stuff that had to do with legal stuff, but as far as what his ultimate conclusion was, that was his business, none of my business, and obviously he didn't share it with me. I think it was pretty emotional, because you got to remember, I mean, he is... Oh, well, I don't know, and Lord help me. Of course, all the parties were there, and probably it was packed with CID people and law enforcement people. And if I recall correctly, I think it's just that he read it. I think that's how it came out, or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe he sent his report on to the general, and the general made his ruling and dismissed the charges. I don't recall, I really don't. But if he did publish it, I guarantee he had one heck of an audience there, and it would have been very hard for him to have gone against the government, because he is the government. He's part of the government. Colonel Rock is. And for him to make a ruling that flies in the face of everything the prosecutors had wanted is not supporting his command and not supporting his other people that are there to keep law and order and blah, blah, blah. So it had to be pretty hurtful for him. But I think he was satisfied that based on the evidence he saw, it just wasn't there. I know, I don't recall that, but he may have, but I just don't remember. And nothing ever came back on me. I mean, because I was nothing. I was just a little old captain, you know, just doing my job. Well, 74, yeah, they thought all of a sudden I was a big shot, you know. I was important, you know, but that was so silly. And there was no contact. I got out in 71. There was no contact between me and anybody in the Army from 71 to 74 till that prosecutor called me. Nothing. I've never talked to MacDonald since this thing's been over with. Recommendations. In the interest of military justice and discipline, it is recommended that 1, all charges and specifications against Captain Jeffrey R. MacDonald be dismissed because the matters set forth in all charges and specifications are not true. There are no lesser charges and or specifications which are appropriate. That just means, you want me to just keep reading it rather than interpret it for you? Okay. And then secondly, that appropriate civilian authorities be requested to investigate the alibi of Helen Stokely, Fayetteville, North Carolina, from her activities and whereabouts during the early morning hours of 17 February 1970 based on the evidence presented during the hearing. That was it. Well, I think he hit the nail on the head when he said the specifications are not true. The specifications were that Jeffrey MacDonald had murdered his wife and his 2 kids, and it was very clear that based on the evidence that they had, that they were not true. They had not committed those murders. And that's what the colonel was trying to put forth here. And by saying there's no lesser charges, you know, a lot of times you'll have like murder, and then you'll have voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, which are lesser included offenses. But in the colonel's opinion and mine, there were no lesser charges or specifications that were appropriate. So in other words, he didn't believe there was any reason to hold this fella and move forward with any type of charges. And of course, the request about investigating Stokely, well, based on everything that was said, the finger sure pointed at her as being one of the 4 people who had committed the murders. And he was like I felt, somebody needed to investigate it. And of course, the military had no authority over her, could not investigate it. So obviously the civilians would have to do that. And that was why they recommended that the civilian authorities do it. So they weren't true. That's right. Probably trying to make the law enforcement part of the military feel less guilty for having screwed this one up. So we just call it insufficient evidence. Of course, the general can call it whatever he wants, but if he's not going to pursue it, then the charge is dismissed, and that's the end of it. Or it should have been the end of it. Should have been. I've had, I don't know how many people ask me, well, why didn't jeopardy attach? Well, it didn't attach because we never had a trial. If we'd had an actual trial, then jeopardy would have attached, and they couldn't have brought it. But this was just a 32, which was like a preliminary hearing, before to decide whether or not sufficient evidence exists to move forward with the charges at all. Yeah. And a lot of people do with 32s. They don't go into all that. In fact, they hold a lot back to use it at trial to surprise the prosecution. But you talk about trying the case at the 32. That's clearly what Siegel did. I mean, he had challenged every piece of evidence they put forth. His cross-examination of the witnesses was extremely thorough and really very well done. I thought it was just great. He destroyed the credibility of most of those witnesses. He didn't make that big of an impression on me, obviously. He was just one of the main CID guys. I'm just trying to remember some of the stuff that he testified to. It just doesn't come back to me, but obviously he didn't make that big of an impression on me. He didn't make that big of an impression on Colonel Rock, and he certainly didn't make that impression with the convening authority, the general. So I would say that he did his job, whatever that was, but didn't do a very good job. Sorry, I can't remember more detail about that. You're lucky you're getting this much. Till 71, I don't remember. Yeah, really. And they reopened the Article 32. And when was that? Right after it? Huh? No. Yeah. Well, I think about this, reopening the investigation, at that point there wasn't any investigation to reopen because it was over as far as the military was concerned. It obviously had to do with Freddie Kassab and he must have gotten somebody involved shortly thereafter. I don't know. I got you. Well, that's interesting. They obviously it worked. It took them 10 years to get there, but it worked. That's horrible. It seemed like there ought to be an end to the matter once you've had this thorough an investigation. And that Article 32 was nothing. That was not short-sighted or left anything out. We covered everything under the imagination you could possibly, every theory. I just can't imagine what else was there to do except try to help the government save face and how they had bumbled it, I don't know. Yeah, they had a lot of theories, yeah. Well, it's because they couldn't decide on what happened. They couldn't explain it and certainly didn't have any motive. And I remember they stuck with that wetting the bed theory of that's the reason why he did it. That's absurd. And I think Colonel Rock thought that was absolutely ridiculous from what I remember about it. His reaction to that was like the table. It just seemed like every time they'd come up with some theory, they'd end up shooting themselves in the foot, And I think that's why he ended up reaching the conclusion that he did. No,
it's all over the testimony.
Yeah, it's all over the testimony. Darn if I remember, it seemed like it was forever. It took a long time by military standards, because most of the time, 32 doesn't last but a day, maybe two. Maybe in all the 32s I ever participated in, maybe two of them lasted more than one day. Most of the time it's just cut and dry, the government just putting on like a bare bones case, just enough to get the charges sworn, get them going to the court-martial, and then you just roll on. The defense normally doesn't do much of anything at the 32. But this case was different because this one, they unloaded on him and challenged him. He was a smart lawyer, I thought. And don't forget, this was a good way to get discovery, too. That's another thing I think Siegel was doing, is he was getting all the evidence he could humanly get that the government had that they hadn't turned over to him. That's a good way to get it. Let's have the 32 officer order it be produced. That was just clever, just very, very smart. Yeah. It's like pulling eye teeth to get them to do anything, because they were trying to, well, guess what? Think about it. They learned about hiding evidence from the defense at the government's case in the military, and it carried over to when you got to the civilian courts and they're prosecuting him, and they did the same thing again, withholding evidence from the defense. I couldn't believe when the Supreme Court of the United States did not grant cert, with certiorari, which is a way of saying, okay, we think an error was serious enough that we're going to take a look at it. They wouldn't even grant cert in the case. I don't think they ever have. I don't think they've ever even, not one time they ever heard this case. They always just defer to whatever happened in the lower courts, but not enough to overturn it. But not enough to overturn the conviction. No. Because we wouldn't be sitting here talking if that had happened. I really feel for him, boy. I mean, he's been in prison now for a long time. Lost his wife, both kids, is licensed to practice medicine, his career as a military officer. That's not what our justice system's supposed to be about. I felt like that the military was just not my place to learn how to practice law. Although I got a lot of wonderful experiences, and I was tickled with that, and I felt like I got as much out of it as I was going to get. I could not imagine me staying to make major, okay? It just was no way. So I got out and came to Columbia, and I joined the 12th JAG Reserve thing for a year, and was in there, and I really enjoyed it because a bunch of lawyers would get together once a week, once a month, and it was really great. And then the commander we had was a great guy. He retired. They brought in some guy from Charleston who, I swear, it looked like it had a lawnmower going through his head. You know, it was just real. And my hair was about as long as it is now. And he told me, he said, well, Captain Beale, he said, you're going to have to get you a haircut here, boy. In the 12th JAG, we're not going to tolerate such disrespect for the position of a captain. I said, really? I said, well, I'll tell you what, I got to practice law 29 days out of the month. I said, and if you don't want me to be a part of your unit, you just say so, Tiger. Because I said, I quit. I said, go do what you want to do. Because I didn't have to stay. I'd had my time. I served 4 years on active duty, and I quit. And I never forget, when I turned 60, my buddies that stayed in called me and told me, said, Hammond, you know, you just made the most brilliant decision because I just got a check for my retirement. And Hammond didn't. Well, that's okay. I walked out there with my hair on my head. So it was just a matter of principle with me. So, and you know that since then I've gone on to try a ton of cases and practice law. I'm a trial lawyer. And I'm going to tell you, I think there's not a better calling that you could have. And of course, at age 76, I still practice law every day. You're lucky you got me here today because I go in the office and practice and still try cases. And the reason's because I love what I do. And I like to see justice is still possible. I have big criminal practice as well as civil. And I love trying criminal cases because it's such a challenge to try to beat such overwhelming odds that how in the world can you possibly win the case, you know? And yet I'm able to do it just because I put a lot of sweat, blood, and tears into it. So I love my profession. I'm really proud of it. I think for the most part we get it right. MacDonald we got wrong, and it just breaks my heart. You know, quite a bit. I still got people always asking me about it, you know, and of course I go back and read these books every now and then. You know, there's been 4 or 5 books, and I think Earls Morris got it right with The Wilderness of Errors. I thought that was a great book. And hopefully what you're going to do is going to be even add to maybe finally finding some justice for him, because he does not deserve to be in the federal penitentiary. They need to let him out and let him go and get on with his life. There's not much left now at his age, so I'm sure he's about my age. So anyway, I love what I do, and I'm so grateful that I still can do it. I'm sad. It really breaks your heart. It really does. And although I haven't talked to MacDonald in all these years, if I could, I'd just say I'm sorry that our system let you down so bad that you're still in prison over it. Because I'm really convinced that he's not guilty of a damn thing. Same thing. I think he was convinced, so was the general, that there was not sufficient evidence. And I'm going to tell you, from what I understand, I wasn't at the trial. From what I understand, what they put forth at the civilian trial in district court, that the evidence was not a whole lot different from what they had presented at our place, although they had expanded upon it and tried to polish it up and make it look like something it wasn't. But still, they were able to convince at least 12 people he was guilty. No. And that's not what our system's all about. Our system is today, under our rules, it is supposed to be transparent. The discovery, particularly in criminal case, is supposed to be wide open. It's supposed to be able to give everything and anything the other side's got so that everybody can get a fair trial. Because all we're after is just the truth, because that's what the verdict should be based on. It's what it stands for. Verdict is just a Latin word for verdicto or something like that, which just means to tell the truth. That's all. And you can't do it if you don't have all the evidence. And when one side's able to hide some from the defense and then they get a conviction, it ought to be overturned, because that's just not fair. It's not playing according to the rules. You talking about fatal vision? Oh my goodness gracious, what a joke that was. As I understand it, it was based upon a book written by Joel McGinnis, who was an author that MacDonald had hired to write his story. And I believe he hired him back when he was still in the Fort Bragg area. I think that was still going on then. And I think he hired him to write the story. And instead he turned on him and wrote it like MacDonald was guilty. And that's what they made this movie about, with half of Hollywood there to star in it. And it really is hard to erase that impression that you get from watching that movie. Because if you watch the movie, you'll be convinced that, gee whiz, he's guilty. Well, that's because of the way it got twisted around by what McGinnis wrote. Of course, McGinnis ended up paying the price. He got sued by him for breach of contract and ended up paying MacDonald a lot of money. But so what? It didn't do him any good. Still in prison. Oh, man, he's the one that played. He played Kassav, if I remember correctly. And yeah, how can you not believe Carl Malden? I mean, he would never play anybody that wasn't telling the truth. Jeez. Now, that's the power of that industry. That I guess when you make these movies, it's really very powerful. They were very well acted, but that's what you were getting. You were getting acting of facts that weren't agreement. That's right. Absolutely. I never got to meet the gentleman. Don't think I ever missed anything. He never bothered to call me. I guess he knew it wouldn't do any good. That was the first time I knew anything about it. It was when I got the subpoena in 74. Traveled up there to good old Raleigh and gave him my testimony. Boy, it did a lot of good. For MacDonald, it didn't help at all, but whatever. Now, I didn't hear another thing about it until 5 years later when I heard he was on trial, and I couldn't believe it. I watched on TV, and, you know, they were reporting on it pretty regularly, I think, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, I had an interest in it. Absolutely. I don't know. I can't believe the Supreme Court never granted cert. Some of these grounds that he was asking for a new trial on were pretty solid, you know. Most of the time you would see him grant cert when you had such an egregious set of facts that they were dealing with. But not this time, and I don't know why. The Supreme Court has to do what they got to do, I guess. Yeah, that's right. No, the state had nothing to do with it. He was indicted by the federal grand jury, tried in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, convicted, went to the Fourth Circuit. They upheld it, and then they denied cert. And of course, in the meantime, after that, I'm sure there were several other hearings that went up. But again, nothing, never got any relief. And I understand it's still up to the Fourth Circuit now, but it seems like it's been there a long time and they haven't made any rulings yet. My guess is they hope he's going to die and they won't have to make the ruling. And that could happen. Oh, well, early on, I didn't have an opinion. I kept an open mind, you know, I wanted to. I wanted to see what the evidence showed. But that's just my nature of being a lawyer, you know. I mean, particularly when I'm sitting in a role as like a judge, it's not my job to decide these cases until you get all the evidence. You know, we have judges a lot of times will instruct the jury when they take a break. You're not allowed to talk about the case now. Can't talk to your fellow jurors, can't call home, can't go home, watch it on TV and see what's going on. You have to wait till you get all the evidence, then you can make the decision, because that is only the appropriate time that you should make a decision. So I kept my mind was open the whole time. But of course, as you went along and theories the government was putting forth got shot down, pretty soon it was all on the defense side of things that were right, and everything was wrong was on the government side. So it was pretty easy to reach that conclusion that he did, that the charges weren't true. Oh, I think probably halfway through it, it was pretty obvious that the quality of the evidence they had was really pathetic. And it was getting worse, not better. and they did not recover from many of the attacks that Siegel presented to the quality of that evidence. I thought he just did a masterful job at what he did. Well, I think it's the biggest travesty of justice I've known of in our judicial system. I think it's horrible to think that this guy is still in the penitentiary for charges that are not true. That's pretty bad. And I'm glad to see that at least he's apparently still got a fighting chance, although the light gets dimmer and dimmer each year as it goes by. And I'm not sure he's going to last out long enough, because how much more can he take, you know? I'm sure well, you know, that's why I love my criminal practice. I don't like to see the little people get walked all over. And believe you me, the government has all the resources to do whatever they want to do. And the poor little people that get charged with these crimes, most of the time, they can't afford a lawyer. So what do they get? They get the public defender. I'm sorry, you're not getting a whole lot. There's nothing wrong with public defenders, but their caseload is so voluminous, they can't possibly do justice to anything because they don't have time. Just not enough time to investigate the cases the way a private lawyer does. I take a lot of pride in doing that, and I've been very blessed. I don't lose very many. Even the tough criminal cases, I've had a lot of luck. Well, I think I told you about the federal case I defended. The guy had 50 charges the U.S. government had brought against him for money laundering and stuff like that at Fort Jackson. And we tried the case, and it was probably the only time I know of in South Carolina that I could ever remember that the jury brought back a verdict of not guilty on all 50 counts. And it was just, what a wonderful feeling for us, because I was convinced he wasn't guilty of it. And it really was nice to see, because in the federal court, very seldom do they ever lose everything. They always get you on something, you know. But that one, we won it all. And it really felt good to have some justice done. Of course, I told you what happened to that. Years later, same guy comes back to see me. This time he got charged with stealing mail from the post office or whatever. As my wife said then, well, you know, there's an awful lot of heat being generated by all these different things. Don't you think maybe he might be guilty? And I said, no, I don't, because he's not guilty until somebody proves his guilt in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. So it just happened that the charges they brought against him the second time were flawed, just like they were the first time. But this time the prosecutor was the same one that had convicted him, had lost all those charges in that first trial. And I told him, I said, you got a bad case this time. And he listened to me. He said, send me your thoughts. And I did. He dismissed all the charges. I told my friend, I said, I would not try it a third time because you're going to run out of luck here one of these days. But yeah, I take a lot of pride in what I do, and I really enjoy my practice. I like civil cases too, but the criminal cases are my favorite. Absolutely the favorite. Yeah, because there's something about keeping a person free from jail when he's not guilty of anything. There's nothing worse. Can you imagine having to go and serve time for something you didn't do? That's pretty bad. Plus, it wouldn't make your wife very happy. Okay, no doubt in my mind, Helena Stokely and her 3 little buddies came on to Fort Bragg because it was open. 3 o'clock in the morning, I imagine they were high as kites on drugs. They came into MacDonald's quarters, killed his wife, then came down, killed the 2 babies that were in separate bedrooms, and then came down, got in a fight with MacDonald, who fought them off, and they finally ran off. He suffered wounds from the attack, finally collapsed on his wife, finally called EMS and got him out there, and that's what happened, I think. I don't think he was guilty of killing anybody. I don't think he could have. Just like this shrink said, couldn't have done it. I believe him. And it's very rare do I ever believe anything a shrink says, but that particular one confirmed my belief that he was not guilty based on the evidence I saw. What was the purpose of using it, the statement that they took? Was it to impeach something he was saying, or, oh, I got you, because he was so evasive? Okay. Well, why didn't they just testify to it? They certainly could do that. Who took that? Who did that interview? Grabner was an idiot. He's the top dog. You know, in the military, you get promoted the dumber you are. The Peter principle, you remember? Yeah, and I was never impressed with Grabner, although he was really impressed with himself. I remember he really thought he was a super cop. mean, how in the world could you possibly ever come to any conclusion, given the fact he's holding this thing, and he says that somebody kept stabbing, that's how he was defending himself. And I think, didn't they try to say that it was because he had it over her and he was stabbing her through it? That's just beyond my capability to even fathom how in the world you could argue something like that. I don't think it showed anything. I try. Well, he clearly saw her breast and her midriff. I remember him talking about that. But yet the photograph, I think, had it all covered up, and he didn't remember it that way. He remembered it opposite. I try. Well, I'm no doctor, but to me, a partial pneumothorax is pretty damn severe. I mean, it can cause you to die. Right. From what I understand. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Honey, can you die from a partial pneumothorax?
Can you die?
Yeah. She's a pharmacist by training. Yeah. So, and of course, I think the silliest thing was the backing up into the knife, and that's the way he got his wounds. That was the most absurd. Somebody testified to it, I guarantee you, because there was a bunch all three of the deceased had a bunch of stab and puncture wounds, but MacDonald only had just a few, comparably. He did what? Oh yeah, I read about him coming in and doing that. Yeah, there was even people who, according to the cops, were there that they didn't even know who they were. Right. Which, I told you what my theory was. Not sure it wasn't one of the assailants that just stuck around to see what was going on. Right. I mean, certainly as plausible as their arguments, Right. But you're right, and of course the cops seeing the floppy-headed woman and out in the rain and whatever 30 minutes an hour beforehand. No, that was a police officer's story. He saw these people. Yeah, that's right. There's any significance to it, other than the fact that it just stunk. There was blood on it, if I remember right. Right. Well, it had the article about Manson, and of course, it was written on the headboard. Killed the pigs, it was all in blood like it was with the Manson murders. And I guess their argument was, well, he was just reading it. That's where he got the idea, so, and here's even a drop of blood on there to prove it. But I think it was obvious the reason because of the article about Manson in there. This is some witnesses that MacDonald called. I remember there was a bunch of that, yeah. That's right, because she was pregnant, I forgot that. Well, what's his motive? I mean, if the government's right, what'd they argue in the trial? That mad enough to kill her? I think the knife clearly was not part of theirs. I don't think they own that, if I remember correctly. The club, I don't think anybody could tie that up to belonging to the house later on.
That's right.
The neighbors, my God, why you want to be killing somebody making all that racket, Bernie was good.
You know what? That's what it's saying.
Is that because of my objections, honey? That they don't get to see the whole story? It's all right. That's my job to try to make sure the only proper legal evidence gets before the jury. One of the things I do in DUI trials, I make the cop perform the field sobriety test in front of the jury, and they fail them every time. And my question to them is, right in front of the jury, Officer Jones, how much you had to drink today? I had nothing to drink. Yeah. But you just move on to the next thing. We'll get them on something else, But it's amazing how many times it fails. That they fail right in front of the jury. And they're just so embarrassed. It just shows how those tests are designed to fail, not designed to pass. That's kind of clever, Do the alphabet backwards, starting with U and ending with E. Can't do it sober, for God's sake, man. How can you do it drunk? Well, whatever. That just comes from having done it for so long and just got to know that it is a good point. It is really a good point. All right. Yeah, my recollection is that I think some of the MPs that originally got there called it into wherever they call it into, and requested roadblocks. And they said that they couldn't do it. It had to be authorized by somebody on up the chain. And by the time they got on up the chain, it was too late. And so it never did get ordered. I think it just makes sense that had they gotten the thing cordoned off pretty quickly, they probably would have caught him still on the post, and then maybe we would have had a little different story to tell. Yeah. Well, he changed. He's like a man with many colors. He can be upset about something one day and then turn around and be just the opposite, obviously, later on. It's a shame. That's right. Wallets disappearing. Yeah. Yeah, if I recall correctly, I think that how that came about was that the photographs that the government had, I think, furnished to the defense showed her body being covered up. And if I recall correctly, I think Siegel handed the photographs to those two MPs, the first ones there, and asked them what do they remember. And they clearly remembered that a portion of her left breast and her midriff were both exposed. But in the photographs, they're not. They're completely covered up. I think with the pajama top and then something else, mat or something, yeah. And so obviously somebody had messed with the crime scene and had put those things over her body, perhaps just out of trying to avoid any embarrassment of any part of her body being seen. I don't know. But it doesn't make sense that if the crime scene was as it was described by those two MPs, and then they turn around and take pictures and it's showing something else, it raises serious questions about preserving the crime scene the way it should be preserved, right? And of course, there wasn't any pajama top on her when they first arrived. Of course, she was already dead when they first arrived. So it only makes sense that it must not have been from that. It must have been when he was holding it up, trying to fend off the attackers, and they took the knife and went through the pajama top. Yeah. Well, he was a pretty strong guy, and he was in good shape. I think he could have had a pretty good shot at fending them off. Now, obviously, he didn't totally succeed because he got stabbed several times, and I guess it was enough to scare them, and they took off first. Then the two kids, he was asleep on the couch, and so that's true. I think they were just totally surprised when they walked in there and he was there. I don't know where they were going. They're going out the front door. I don't know. Back in those days, we really didn't lock doors the way we do today. It was very rare that you ever locked doors. Nobody ever paid any attention to it because nothing ever happened. After that, people started locking the doors. Yeah.
It was a real scare.
It was a real scare, rightfully so. And they shut down the fort, too. I don't think it allowed people to come in on it anymore. I know it's the way that Jackson today, you cannot come onto the fort without a pass. Yep, faintly. That wasn't actually a part of the 32. It happened outside. Apparently, the cops decided they wanted a hair sample. And so, brilliantly, rather than do it the normal way you do it, they just tried to pull him over out on the streets. And of course, he resisted and did not want to acquiesce in that kind of foolishness. And my recollection is I think they eventually did get one, but it would have been very easy to get it. All you got to do is have his commanding officer order him to give it. There might have been some legal problems from that, but clearly it's easy to get it. You don't need to act like a posse and track him down and try to jerk it out of his head. That just seems a bit not in keeping with normal procedure. Of course, there's nothing normal about this. The only thing I remember is there were just massive stab and puncture wounds. And the kids, I remember, at least one of them had the broken arms. Colette had the broken arms. The kids, that wasn't, yeah, that's right. I didn't actually see the bodies, but I did see photographs, and it was pretty gruesome. And they were violently killed, no question about that. Well, it didn't fit the picture, of who was presented to us as being Jeffrey MacDonald. He just wasn't the type that would do that. Remember that even the shrinks said he couldn't do it, the government shrinks. So, and the fact that he wasn't as severely wounded, well, they were mortally wounded, made sense to us because he was, I think, surprised. He surprised them, they surprised him. And I think he was successful in fighting them off, but because of those stab wounds in where the pneumothorax was, I think he eventually succumbed to that. And I think then the next thing that happened, he crawled in there to try to help her. I think he also called EMS somewhere in there to get some help. Of course, that's when he was telling everybody about it. He was attacked by this woman in a floppy hat and blonde wig and muddy boots. I remember something about muddy boots. That was a pretty good description for somebody that had just seen her a very short period of time. And it kind of fit all the other descriptions of the people we had heard about who were out there in and about Fort Bragg that time of the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever, theory. Yeah, that's right. Because it had an article in there about the Manson murders. Oh, I'm sorry. There was an Esquire magazine that was found in their apartment that had a drop of blood on it, if I remember correctly. And one of the articles in that magazine was a description about the Manson murders that had happened out in California some short time before this happened. And I recall the government arguing that that was the blueprint for how this crime scene ended up, where kill the pigs, written in blood on the headboard, and how they were brutally murdered. The same thing happened to Sharon Tate and some other people. I can't remember who all got killed, but that was their argument. I didn't buy it, but I wasn't the article. Really? I think so. I like your theory better. Yeah, your theory is that it's literally beyond belief that MacDonald would have brutally killed his wife and two children, and then pick up the magazine, read it, and decide he needed to write this stuff in blood and literally recreate the Manson way of doing it. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense. It makes a whole lot of sense to me, what you said. Here, this magazine and this article is out for public consumption. Just as likely that Helena Stokely and her buddies had read this and gave them some good ideas how to pull off a terrible murder. Faintly, yeah. And it was true. It wasn't a false statement. And they should have been on trial with the way they had conducted the investigation. That's the whole purpose of cross-examination, is to test the theory of the government and the quality of the evidence. And the way you do it is by cross-examination. And as we like to say, Bernie ripped him a new one. Okay. Never seen it in my life, ever. Yeah. That you ask about how many times have I ever been privy to the fact where somebody has had an Article 32 in the Army or any military, cut loose, and then later indicted and tried and convicted in a civilian court. This time it was a federal court. I've never, ever seen anything like that. All the legal literature I'm familiar with, and I keep up with it pretty well, it's just hard to believe. Most people thought that it was double jeopardy, but of course I've explained it wasn't. So, no, it's just something that's so rare. I mean, everybody thought it was over with once the 32 decided the charges weren't true. What is there to indict him for if they aren't true? Didn't make any sense, but yet they did it. Yeah, I think so. I believe that the government had been shown up to be very poor investigators, and the way they had handled the investigation of this crime was almost a joke. And I think Kassab, he just felt like he had been fooled all along by being MacDonald's supporter. And then once he's turned loose because there's no truth in the charges, he then thinks back and decides that maybe he was the one that did it. And I think he then gets on his high horse and rides off to Congress and gets him some help there to get him indicted. And he was successful. Oh, yeah. Well, they were happy to, because this would give them a chance to further do it right. Since they screwed it up the first time, maybe they get it right the second time. That's for sure. I think they were really embarrassed by how this thing got bumbled. I particularly remember when the FBI refused to get involved because of how they'd screwed up the crime scene. The word was somebody's head was going to roll because this was obviously very poorly handled. I don't know whether any heads rolled, but should have. Sorry, don't remember the feathers. But obviously they made a bigger impression on him than it did me. Rock, it's his idea. Oh, he just decided that he wanted to go and actually see the place where all this took place. And I don't remember whether the government went with us the first time. We made several trips, but I just remember going over there, and he was very interested in that table. That apartment was not very big, and you got a much better perspective. The length of that hallway was not far from where MacDonald was to where the bodies were. And I think it just gave him an idea, like the phone was still there, the back door and where they'd come in. I think it just gave him a much better hindsight as to what this whole picture looked like, because he'd been listening to them testify about it. I think it really helped him. And of course, the table was the coup de grace. I mean, that was the thing that made him look so foolish, because they were really damn determined that this table would always fall on the top because it was so top heavy. And they were just wrong. That's all. Captain Beale, put it back up now. I'm going to do it another way. And we did it 2 or 3 times, laying on its side every time. That's when he kind of chuckled and said, well, so much for that, And I think that was really the kind of the clue that that, hey, maybe these guys are really pumping it up to something it's not, because they were really, really pushing that theory that obviously it was a setup, that MacDonald had put it on its side, and that he had set it back up there, that actually flipped all the way over. Yeah, I bet. I just remember MacDonald had a lot of character witnesses that all said he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I remember something about the wife being very content, very happy about her marriage to him and how much better they had it. And I forgot this originally, but she was even pregnant with her third child at the time this murder took place. So really there was another murder actually in the whole thing. And all the witnesses that he put up as character all just sang his praises about what a great doctor he was, great soldier he was, a great husband he was, and that he was just not the type that went around murdering people. But that's what I remember. I don't remember their names and all that. It's just been too long. But all the character witness, as it should be, was all very, very favorable for him. Ice pick. I forgot the ice pick. That's right, yeah. And it was not from their kitchen, or it was Mildred being Kassab's wife. Yeah, I do. I don't remember what she said, but it's been easy enough to find out. I do just test hers and get a sample from her, compare it to whatever. I guess they didn't do that. I don't remember that. No, doesn't ring a bell. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well.